Welcome to another March on Milwaukee 50th part of our digital series we've been running since May. And actually, in May, we did the open housing marches. June, we discussed the Chapman Hall takeover, a critical story of Latinx history in Milwaukee, kind of right subsequent to the open housing marches. We decided to use July as a place to talk about, or because we miss kind of the Milwaukee summer that we normally have during a pandemic. We talked about food, but that quickly became a gateway to great conversations about culture, about power, about politics. And back in May, we decided to take on the topic of voting rights in August. We said, you know what, that'll feel relevant in that moment. The DNC will theoretically be happening in Milwaukee, although increasingly that doesn't seem to be the case. And then just the last 10 days or so we could not have picked a more consequential string of events to lead into a conversation about voting rights, whether we want to talk about John Lewis, whether we want to talk about Donald Trump's recent statements and actions, whether we even want to talk about the Shepard Ferry mural that was about voting rights that may never happen here, and what that might say about power dynamics. I don't think we'll get into that today. But point is, the conversation is about voting rights, and because this is a historically oriented series designed with educators and students in mind, we want to set some context to say, conversations about voting rights don't come out of nowhere. This has been part of, as long as there's been an idea of the United States of America, this has been part of the struggle of this country. So with that, Rob, do you want to share anything else any background, anything relevant you think people should know out there?
No, I think you covered it all. Just so excited to hear from the folks who are on our panel. Thank you for the birthday wishes, folks, on our panel today, because so much about this question associated with voting hits right at the heart of citizenship and how we are able to not only engage in the political process but effectuate social change. And voting is the cornerstone to our representative democracy. It's how we are able to make a statement about what we think our political leadership should be doing, who we think should represent us. It's how we engage. It is so critical, and it's ever more critical given the challenges. Hey, how's it going? That we're facing today. And I'm out on the porch. I know you can't see me, folks. I apologize for that. I'm having computer issues, and so I'm saying hello to my neighbors and everything else. Yeah.
So we have with us three phenomenal people. Rob is kind of going to be part of the panelist mix today, but Paru and Elisa, would you guys mind giving us a quick introduction of who you are?
Sure, I can start. This is Paru Shah. I'm a professor of political science at UW-Milwaukee, and my research really focuses on race and representation. And so I've worked with Rob probably for the last 6 or 7 years on voting rights issues. So excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
And I'm Eloisa Gomez, and I'm I'm a member of the League of Women Voters of Milwaukee County. I am the chairperson for our Comité por el Voto Latino, Latinx voter outreach team, and I'm also a co-chair of the League of Women Voters of Wisconsin's Community Alliances Committee. So I've been active in the effort of trying to provide resources to the Latinx community so that it encourages registration for voting, as well as providing voter education information that is bilingual and that is culturally appropriate. Thank you for having me too.
Absolutely. And Rob,
shout out the League of Women Voters. Can we just shout out the League for a minute? The League of Women Voters, boy, they get it done. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for everything you all do.
Rob, would you normally, as a host of this series today, you're more of a panelist, would you give yourself kind of an introduction specifically to your work connected to voting and voting rights?
I'm actually trained in what we call legal history. And so the question of voting is right in the heart of looking at some of the legal and political questions associated with U.S. history and African American history. And so there's not much that I can teach and or research where political representation doesn't come into the equation in very important ways. And so, as Paru mentioned, we've worked on some things together. We're in the midst of finishing an article on our voter ID case, in fact, here, Frank v. Walker. And so we've been working on that for a bit, using and relying on the expertise of the legal minds who helped to engineer that. But, I want to say one other thing. Paru and I, the first time we kind of collaborated, she called and said, "Hey, come poll watch with us." And so we sat down, and this was it 2012? Was it that election, Paru, I think? And what we witnessed was this remarkable set of experiences where folks would come vote. And obviously we have same-day registration. And then we saw people getting on the phone saying, "Hey, you can come down to the polling place and register right now and vote." I mean, we saw, dozens of people go home and bring people back to register and vote that same day. And so that was my introduction to the work that Paru does. And so it's been great to hear her talk about and teach and instruct on not only the practices and the challenges associated with voting, but then the outcomes of elections too. And so all of that is key. So I'm a historian, and I work over at Marquette University, and these questions around voting are central to what I do.
So, it's Rob's birthday, but he's giving all of us an anti-present. We're not going to be able to see his face in this talk, so everyone soak in what he looks like right now. He's actually without goatee at the moment. But that is what he looks like. His glasses are a little different than that actually right now. I think you have it.
Yeah, they're thicker now. They're transition lenses now,
Okay, cool. All right. So with that, let's keep moving. Keisha, can we move to the next slide? As a opening question, we're going to be talking about the history of voting rights and contemporary issues and questions and answers. That is a note. Folks are encouraged to ask questions, make comments at any point in the chat, whether you're watching this on Facebook or in the Zoom with us right now. But to kick things off, as I mentioned in the introduction, the last stretch here leading up to today has been a very consequential one for the topic that we've chosen, and really only by accident. July 17th, John Lewis passed, and just 5 days ago or so was his funeral, or just last week. So to each of the panelists, can you discuss the significance of the passing of John Lewis on this for the modern younger generation, and kind of what the funeral and some of those messages represented?
Sure, I could be glad to start. And just to say, this image that's posted here, the photo of John Lewis before the tragic results of that in front of the Edmund Pettus Bridge is something I think people, associate the two hand in hand because of the brutality that the world experienced that day. But I think the message is that he didn't stop there. Well, maybe there's two key messages. He chose nonviolence in the face of violence, and he committed his life towards nonviolence. And to me, that is one of the greatest messages that his life symbolizes, as well as the ongoing commitment, that whole notion of resiliency in the face of so many struggles. I think that is important. And he was quoted as saying, "The vote is precious. It's almost sacred. It is the most powerful nonviolent tool we have in democracy," and he certainly lived that.
Yeah, I usually when I teach a class on minority voting rights, we watch a video about this march, and it's always inspiring. Every year you watch it, and I think for students who might know who he is kind of more abstractly, but to see what it felt like to really be fighting for voting, this ability to vote, and particularly amongst young people who I think get the bad rap of being uninterested in democratic politics, or democracy, I should say. Just to like remember what people have been fighting for this whole time, and that we continue to fight for. I'm also I'm a huge fan of how what's been happening this year has kind of moved into professional sports. And I don't know if you guys have been watching, but there's a WNBA team, Dreams, that's kind of being very politically active. And one of the young women there, referenced John Lewis when talking about her political activism. And I think his leadership and his legacy is exemplary for those of us who think about like, what does it mean to live a life of civil rights and looking for justice.
Well, and his life and career and legacy, also emphasizes the importance of taking the protest moment and then moving forward into decision-making positions. It's one thing to create demonstrative protests that accentuate and highlight the problems, but then he goes on to be a part of the political structure to then continue to anchor the changes and to make sure that those changes have not only his voice, but the voice of others represented at the table. In limited terms, we often say from protest to politics, and for an individual, I don't know many others in this era who have dedicated their lives in the way that John Lewis has. And this is just not only important in terms of recognizing his life of activism and his life of political leadership, but then to also understand the legacy that he left, as we see so many folks taking to the streets now demanding substantive change. And for that change to be meaningful and long lasting, we have to continue that effort and continue engaging in the political process. Otherwise, we know how easily, as this moment teaches us, how easily we can slip into this era of fascism in its most grotesque forms, as we see the way that not only our federal government but other local governments have responded to people who are basically making some very clear and fair-minded demands for structural change. And so we owe a debt to John Lewis and so many others. And I'm gonna just take this moment to shout out Ella Baker. We'll just say Ella Baker today. That's been my theme over the last few weeks as we've been talking about the struggles, is to also highlight the organizer of organizers and her legacy as well.
I do think a speech that will live forever, rightfully so, will be the eulogy that Barack Obama gave to John Lewis at his funeral. So I would highly suggest, if you haven't watched it, don't watch the clips of it, watch the whole thing. It's worthy. I think it's like 40 minutes, but it's worth watching for sure.
Absolutely.
Keisha, can we move on to the next slide? So thank you everyone for those reflections, because it speaks to the past, the present, and the future. And to better understand the present and the future, we're going to start in the past with the discussion of voting rights history, the history of important landmarks in voting rights, leading us to those contemporary struggles. So these are just some of the topics we're going to hope to touch here in the next 15 minutes or so, or 20 minutes if you're a student watching this in your classroom. This is going to be hopefully everything you need to know about the history of voting rights to understand where they are today in about 20 minutes. How is it? We didn't discuss that, so you guys are like, come on, that's too much pressure. But what I'm going to do real quick here is I have a set of images that were shared from Rob that are going to be kind of the backbone of this conversation. So sort of a series of primary documents of different forms and formats that we're going to use as the backbone of our conversation here. So Rob, why don't you tell us what we're seeing? I think you might be the point guard here in this game of pickup basketball.
Well, these are a set of images that chronicle the moment of the abolition of the institution of slavery, and then also the earthquaking changes that occur in this moment where the United States is experiencing its first experiment with racial democracy. Obviously, this image is capturing not only the experiences of enslavement, but then also it captures the familial journey toward some semblance of citizenship. And you see, obviously, Abraham Lincoln and his role in this what would be called a political cartoon of the time. And so this comes out of the Reconstruction era, and it captures that moment of emancipation and the way that folks are moving from a particular state of enslavement and into the treacherous terrain that becomes the journey toward full citizenship that we're still negotiating today.
I'll move to the next image here, and also
You know,
yeah, go ahead.
just real quick, part of what we have to always be mindful of is that the 13th Amendment and its limitations, and even the grand nature of the 14th Amendment, voting has always been reserved for elite, politically elite, economic elites in our country. Voting has been a practice that has oftentimes excluded more people than it included. The 13th Amendment didn't necessarily guarantee that folks would be able to engage in the political process, although the assumption, of course, is that if you are indeed a citizen, if you are no longer shackled in the institution of slavery, then you should be able to engage in that political process. But that gets us to some fundamental questions of who indeed has been welcomed into the broader body politic, and who can have a say about what the political trajectory looks like. And the 13th Amendment is limited in that respect.
I would agree with Rob on that. It's been more exclusionary at that point, and certainly it left out women. Right now we're celebrating the 19th Amendment, its 100th year, and certainly left out women early on in the process. It left out the Native American community in this country. So it really had a focus that was pretty much focus on the white male community.
Yeah, and I want to add, I think when you think about like the founding of the United States, right, we're looking at this idea and the kind of the creation of race as a reason, as like a marker of citizenship. It was also a marker of being a human, and like who's human, who's not, right? And thinking about the 3/5 clause. And so this idea that, right, like whiteness is the only thing that's associated with citizenship becomes, I think, really important as we look at how groups, particularly non-Black groups, try to associate with whiteness to get citizenship, right, over time. And kind of, I think it becomes really, I think, a way in which, to your point, Rob, of keeping more people out than bringing people in. And even today, I think that there's ways in which the exclusion happens, maybe not so explicitly around race, but the ideas of who is worthy of citizenship, who's worthy of having that right to vote, right? When we think about all the work that you've done, Rob, around felons, right? Like just those kinds of conversations, I think, are about it's kind of like this kind of core idea in American politics around being a citizen and the rights that come with that. And it's about rights as a U.S. citizen, but also, I think, kind of human rights, right? That people try to, I think, struggle with a little bit.
Absolutely.
So I think, I mean, this image really underscores a lot of what you just said, right? Like,
Absolutely.
like who has humanity and who doesn't. I mean, who even has a right to exist within the world without looking over their shoulder.
Well, and the last image, and we can keep going through them. The last image really emphasizes that the moment of the eradication of slavery presents a whole other set of clashes that are the extensions of the Civil War, and that for the young people who listen to this, the question is really simple: where did the Confederate soldiers go after the war? you know, they went back home. They went back home to see people who they had determined were beneath them in terms of their humanity, uh, acting as free people, doing the things that free people do, creating institutions, learning to read and write, using their skills to create economic independence. And so, you know, the White League, the KKK, they're made up of Confederate soldiers. The wars, the Civil War itself continues well into the 1860s, 70s, and 80s. And even though the 14th Amendment is designed and intended to um, expand this notion of citizenship and broaden it to include folks who were recently enslaved, it is certainly contested terrain. It's an environment that is far more violent than we could ever imagine. The election of 1868 was probably the most violent election in American history that went undocumented. We know the history of communities, entire communities that were destroyed. And it's clan violence that is rampant in trying to make sure to curtail the political expansion that African Americans are exploring in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War. And then the 15th Amendment, you know, as we know, doesn't actually give an affirmative right to vote. It suggests that you can't deny the right to vote on account of race, but then there are all these other mechanisms that then become part of the voting landscape. As we see these gentlemen here, you know, the 15th Amendment doesn't do what we assume it was going to do, which is to secure the right to vote. Instead, we get literacy tests and poll taxes and grandfather clauses and other mechanisms that are used to, again, restrict voting for white populations overwhelmingly, and more specifically, white elites in the South.
Do you want to move forward on images, or do you want to?
Yeah, we can
folks
keep
wanna
going.
talk-
Let's keep going. Yeah. Let's keep
Okay.
going. It's just another one of these brilliant displays that help to capture the moment there immediately post-emancipation during the Reconstruction era, as we see the celebration of emancipation, but then also the celebration of folks beginning to engage more directly in voting. And again, this is extraordinarily contested terrain, but this image here is very celebratory in what the promises of the 15th Amendment ought to include. It's just, you know, then we got these distinguished gentlemen here. You know, there were thousands of elected officials, Black elected officials during the era of Reconstruction in the second half of the 19th century. And some of these folks were elected to Congress. You have folks who are being elected to lead local communities and state legislatures as well. And so for white Southerners, their worlds were turned upside down as we see scores and scores of African-American men engaging in the political process as political leaders. And while, you know, Black women and women broadly couldn't vote, Black women are engaged politically in other ways. They're certainly taking part in the process by which Black communities become more politically solvent and more politically engaged. And it's important for us to highlight that even despite that there was this restriction on women voting, women were very much engaged in the political process in a whole range of ways. I just thought this was great ephemera from an archive. this just, you know, it just highlights that this is out of Oregon. It just highlights how important voting was, that in 1870, there are conversations, public conversations being held about the importance of the ballot as far west as Oregon. You know, literacy tests embodied a whole range of practices. Some of that included questions around interpreting the U.S. Constitution, interpreting state constitutions. It was really up to the registrar, who had complete determination and control over who might ultimately be allowed to vote. And we know that there are current manifestations of all these voting restrictions that continue to live with us. And so this cartoon here highlights that indeed literacy tests became one of the many ways to disfranchise folks. This is one of my favorites. It's as menacing of an image as possible, but it is used as racial propaganda. You see here the black incubus sitting atop a ballot box. This is what happens when you allow Black people to vote in the emerging Jim Crow era. Obviously, Black men who are pictured here as this creature with talons and a tail. And
I mean, is there a difference between that and a president directly addressing suburban housewives and talking about low-income housing? I mean, is there any difference between this image and that exact gesture? I mean, they feel so. I guess point is there's just a really long legacy of this kind of.
Well, you know, and we should probably let's talk about the voter ID laws. I mean, this is
well, and I was just going to say, like, I think what's interesting is that we've gone from, right, there's this fear of the Black voter to the ignoring of the Black voter for a long time, like, doesn't matter, not enough, to, I think, kind of coming full circle to, like, we should be worried and working hard to disenfranchise them, figuring out ways to think about both to keep them from the ballot and then to mobilize individuals to potentially vote against their interests. So to your point, Adam, like, I do think that's something that's happened for a long time. And that this image probably is really salient today as it was back then. So.
Well, in the arguments around voter fraud, who's going to commit voter fraud?
Right.
And our own legislature said it very clearly. Felons, which creates the imagery of the Black person who's incarcerated, who's going to commit voter fraud, and then immigrants, right? The Latino voter who is somehow or another going to commit voter fraud, even though there is absolutely no evidence of voter fraud ever occurring. And yet the racial imagery that we see here is still a part of our public discourse around engaging in the political process, that there's somehow this menace that's going to take part and disrupt and then manipulate the voting process in many respects at the expense of continued expressions of white supremacy.
So I think we have like a minute left for this section. So I might just, it's your format, Rob, not mine.
Well, I mean, I'm just adding some pretty cool images. Folks from Harlem, this is a 1950s image out of Harlem where folks are in line to vote. Well, this is a direct contrast to what's happening in the Jim Crow South at the very same time, right? You have here folks who are, there's Ella Baker. That's all. We just shout Ella Baker out periodically. That's all. I just dropped that in. This is great though. Let's scroll through this a little bit, Adam, and let's look at some of the questions that went into the Alabama voter registration form in the 1950s. And these are some of the questions that were posed on this particular document. I got this from a family who preserved it from their experiences. Have you ever been charged or convicted of a felony? Can you scroll back up? There's one question. Yeah, I'm sorry. Just go back down. Oh, here, you can go back up just a little bit. If you are or have been a dope addict or a habitual drunkard, explain as fully as you can. You know, this is we can't even imagine a voter registration form having these kinds of questions today. This is not a long time ago.
And there's also some, subjective ones. Name some of the duties and obligations of citizenship.
Yeah.
Those are, so this is really long too, right? Like,
absolutely. Yeah.
There's a lot of, and this is what people had to fill out in order to vote. Correct? Yeah. Or to register to vote.
Well, and I think another important piece of like understanding the 15th Amendment and how we end up with the Voting Rights Act is that there's a national law around preventing discrimination from voting, but states get to make decisions, and we still have that today on how people register to vote, right? And what the process is for that. And so they can say that they're not discriminating because everybody has to take the test. Everybody has to have a voter ID. Everybody has to have whatever the piece is. and have that be different in different places, so that, you know, like in Alabama, it can be really difficult, and in another state, it can be not so difficult. And that leads to kind of the need for something like the Voting Rights Act, which I know is our next topic. So.
Just wanted to come back to this document. The League of Women Voters also provides these kinds of examples when they go into the high school classrooms and explains the history of the Voting Rights Act. And we do have, I don't think we have this particular one, but we do use a sample from one from years ago in which it really was an onerous process, and in fact, an impossible process to complete it in order to vote. So we use this type as one of our educational tools to explain it to young people.
And Eloisa, you actually, we found this document right in our pre-conversation. Can you just talk a little bit about what we're seeing here?
Yeah, you know, in the state of, in Texas, for example, and I'm sure it's in other states where, you know, there was a poll tax where you did have to pay money to vote. And here, you know, I don't see the amount offhand.
$1.50.
$1.50. So I've heard of $1.76 from a woman who explained that to me about what they had to pay in order to vote. So this is an example where it was a barrier for people. It was an intended barrier to keep people, Latinos and others, from voting. So I've never seen a particular receipt before, and it's interesting to see, and it really does highlight the fact that this is just another barrier keeping people from voting.
You know, we like using primary documents. We've never thought of it that way, but they are kind of the receipts of history, right?
Exactly.
You know, this image is from Freedom Summer, where we know in 1964, large amounts of young people, college students, then go to Mississippi and directly engage white supremacy by looking to register African Americans across the state. And I don't think we can imagine how violent Mississippi was at this time. We obviously know the violence that occurred in Alabama during the march from Selma to Montgomery. But if voting is restricted with literacy tests and poll taxes, if you happen to outmaneuver all of that, the one key element that also restricted voting was white violence. The use of vicious violence to frighten folks from showing up to vote. And yet people do, in miraculous ways, muster the courage to challenge that system.
So I think if we were to, you know, we had a few more images we were going to show, but I think we kind of got close to where we wanted to get in this conversation, which is just to point out that the struggle for voting rights and then the very active and rich history of voter suppression is one that's shaped the moment we live in now. So I think this will be a little bit more of an open conversation. I'd love to hear a lot from the panelists here on these core questions we have here on the voting landscape today, how groups such as youth, racial minority populations generally, non-English speaking, have been engaged or engaged by either side. And then we can end with a discussion of Shelby County. So I think there's a word missing from that one. What does the voting landscape look like today?
I can start with this one. You know, I would say that there are, for presidential elections, we have, I would say, some areas of the country, and Wisconsin is one of them, that we see a lot of voter turnout. You know, it's gotten much better in terms of people being able to exercise their right to vote. But I would also argue that, and I think both the panelists have said, you know, I think alluded to this, that there continues to be a lot of efforts towards voter suppression. So it might not be the poll tax, it might not be a difficult literacy test, but there are other ways in which individuals are left from, or kind of removed from the process of voting. And I think one of the ones that kind of comes up to mind immediately is one that Rob and I just participated in, which was watching what happened in the April election here in Milwaukee, where we went from over 100 voting sites to 5 in-person voting sites during a pandemic, where it became very difficult to do absentee voting. And so thinking through the ways in which our government and institutions and structures, make decisions that limit when and how people can vote, I think is still something that, happens too often. And as we think about what's going to happen in November, when we're still going to be in the middle of a pandemic, it's, I think, one of those moments where you have to ask yourself, like, where do people actually value, does our government, do the people in elected office value my right to vote? And how are they trying to make it easier for me? And in what ways can I fight for that, right? I think the League of Women Voters and other organizations like that are really focused on the idea that we need to continue to fight for the enfranchisement of individuals. We haven't actually been able to, get there for everybody.
One quick point. I know that one of the core strategies of voter mobilization, whether that's left, right, nonpartisan, whatever, is creating plans to vote with individual voters. And if, as you're describing, I mean, that election we had, the April election, it was like down to the last minute, right? Like we
The
didn't
day before.
yeah, it was like, and so I think how disruptive the last minute, like there's sort of, whether you're trying to do it or not, there's a voter suppression residue if you're yanking the rules back and forth, because people have plans to vote that, if on the day of voting doesn't look like what you're planning, you stay home, right? So,
well, and I would argue, we were talking about this during the pre-session as well. Like, I think the confusion is, purposeful, right? Like, there's people who are really smart who are like, I have no idea what I'm supposed to do, who are paying attention. And so if you're the kind of person who normally votes the day of, and, people have lots of things going on in their lives. So to not realize that you needed to 3 weeks ago send in your absentee ballot, I think is, obviously there's just a group of individuals who that particularly harms, and they tend to be younger, they tend to be people of color. And so it's like this kind of swath of individuals who continually have to fight for those those opportunities.
Adam, you mentioned President Obama's eulogy. And one of the key, among the many key statements he made was today the real challenge is that there's so many obstacles that it encourages folks not to partake in the voting process at all. And that is its own type of voter suppression, to make it confusing, to make it seem out of reach, to make it such that folks will sort of opt out because of the confusion, because of the challenges. That apathy, or that encouraged apathy, is a core tactic today. And there's a famous document, I don't know if you all know this one, but it said, when government becomes destructive to those ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish. And when our government is intervening to our detriment, that rises to the level of human rights abuses. It's not only abuse on our civil rights, but it's a broader conversation around human rights. To what extent are we discouraged from taking part in a political process through voting, which is, again, the primary means by which we get to have a conversation with our elected officials. I got a puppy over here that wants to play with me.
I want to add to that, to say that I would love to explore further how the young in particular, and not just the younger voter rather, perhaps has disconnected democracy from voting, or politics rather. There's many of them are kind of sick of the politics that they see, that's really not representing them. But and I think voting is in part connected to politics, but the bigger piece around democracy, is sort of gets left off as a result. And I really think the two have to be further merged in people's minds to because younger voters are known to historically vote less often than older citizens. And so I really think we've got to merge the two further. You know, my work with the League of Women Voters as a nonpartisan organization is really to, you know, continue to educate. And that's important. And I guess I just wanted to switch, if it's okay, to, you know, I just want to highlight a little feature around the Latinx voters, and I'll use the word Latinx or Latino, whichever people prefer. And that is to say, you know, now there are 32 million, estimated 32 million Latino voters in the United States. And knowing that the Latino population in the United States is, the median age is younger than most other populations. And so it's going to it'll continue to be a larger part of the electorate in the future. We really have to, with all groups, figure out how to best engage them so that they do get out to vote, but understand the issues that are before them as they make their decisions around to vote. Our group with the League of Women Voters of Milwaukee County is El Comité por el Voto Latino, the Latinx voter outreach team. So we are really pouring out translated information. I would say that the majority of Latinos in Milwaukee are English speaking, but there are plenty that their primary language is Spanish. And we decided early on that regardless of the percentage, there is a code word for connection, and that is having the material provided in both languages, having it in Spanish. Su voto es su voz is something that came back out of the 1960s out of Texas. And that was to say to people, hey, your vote is your voice. And so we sort of reclaimed that here in the 2020 to say we're using that to reach out to our historical past and say presently, you know, there is so much work to do around engaging Latinos in terms of voting. So I just want to highlight the fact that, and we think about here in current times, that our community really has to be engaged, regardless of race, gender. We really have to get out and support one another to understand what's involved in voting. So I'm really pleased that the League is involved in this, but they're involved with all communities to get out the vote and to provide forums for discussion around, you know, what does democracy look like?
Can we take, Ben shared with us one of the questions that was posed from Bethany Perkins on Facebook. And I think you touched on a little bit in your last comments there, but Bethany points out, based on the fact that the propaganda we were looking at feels so relevant today, what do you say to change the mind of a citizen who doesn't feel their vote could possibly change anything, because if it could, it would have been changed by now? So that's maybe a different isotope of the question you were just discussing, that, you know, like, frankly, yeah, when people are apathetic or indifferent, I feel like a lot of times that's rooted in sanity. And so how do you compel someone like that, who I think is taking what I think is a really logical, logical point of view of saying, well, if it's this messed up, if I use, the logic of just, regression and go backwards, what's the point of me getting involved today?
Let me start with that, because I'm going to respond using some of the research Paru and I have done on the voter ID laws. There's a case out of Indiana which sets in motion and provides the legal precedent for voter ID laws. And many of these policies are, as Paru mentioned earlier, colorblind. However, in the state of Indiana, out of which this case arises, from 1990 to 2000, the Latino population in the state had increased by several hundred thousand. And while that voter ID law was indeed colorblind, it was clearly intended to attend to the emerging population of Latino voters. It was clearly intended to attack and restrict those voting options and access to the ballot box. And my response to that question is, if indeed we know now for certain that these attacks on voting are designed and intended to undermine democracy, that should piss people off enough to stay focused in the process, because these efforts are designed to limit our democratic exchange and our democratic voice, our voice in what democracy is really supposed to mean. And these laws are specifically targeted in such a way to really and truly maintain a level of white supremacy such that Latino and Black voters continually lose their political voices, and their political voices then become almost muted in the face of these policies. And so my response to that question is, folks who are listening in, or folks who might stumble across these notions, you should really be pissed off. You should be angry at your political leadership, and it's largely a Republican project, but be pissed off at Democrats too, you know, because your voice, your contribution to this experiment in democracy is valuable, and we see how important it is. And as a number of people have said, if voting wasn't important, why is it that so many folks in political power do all they can to limit your access to the voting box? If it's not important, why is there so many mechanisms designed to restrict your options and your access?
Thank you. That's good.
All right,
Yeah,
this is a competition now. Who's got the best statement to someone why they should go?
And another thing, Adam.
You had your chance, Rob. It's Faru's time.
Well, I was just going to add, Rob reminded me of the time that we were poll watching in 2012. There were definitely young people there who were out because they were told they can't vote. And they were like, you know, I think there is that mobilization factor of being, you know, like told you can't do that, and feeling like, hey, you can't take that right away from me. And I think about that video of John Lewis, and I mean, people have literally sacrificed their lives to get us to this place now. So I would hope that young people, I understand, I feel the same apathy, I think, as others. I think it's not just young people who feel this moment of what's going on and how am I going to make a difference. But I think, you know, like, I think to have a little bit of a long view and hope that together, like, we can make, you know, I guess there are changes, important changes that are being made. And I study mostly state and local government. And I think about the number of women and women of color and people of color running for office at that level. And I am excited because I think there is going to be some significant change in those spaces. And so those, you know, names are on those ballots too. So it's not just about, you know, who's running for president, but these things really, I think, matter in your day-to-day life in ways that, you know, decide like how much tuition you're going to pay and things like that. And so you want to be involved if you're a young person and being part of that decision making.
Yeah, I think I agree, you know, that there are reasons to be hopeful with what we're seeing with our young people. I think there is also a lot of apathy with our young people, and not just our young people, and I think there's kind of a narrow view about their role. And I think for educators, our role is to expand that so that they see a much broader, a bigger picture, that historical picture, which is, you know, being offered today. And then I think when you have that broader context, you're saying, okay, this isn't about just this particular vote. I'm going to vote for this candidate that is the lesser of two evils. And, you know, I won't vote or I will vote, but I'm not happy about it. But expand it to, you know, there's a lot more involved here. And so, yes, I am doing this, you know, with holding my nose, but there's a bigger picture that I am supporting as a result of this.
You know, I think one tactic that I've been seeing lately that's really sophisticated and kind of quiet, Black Leaders Organizing Community has been hosting forums with people, but that also just get into what are the basics of some of the down ballot jobs that are done. Like when you get that ballot and you see Register of Deeds or you see, you know, comptroller, it's almost like a joke. Like, but when you start learning about what those things do, it's like, whoa, like that's actually really important.
And then I think to accompany that, Liberate MKE, which is another local group that's working, they've started finding entry points for people to start influencing these civic processes and made their voice heard directly within budgetary processes. So I think maybe that's like, so I guess in some ways, like, yes, the winds of apathy are strong, but like in a weird way, because so many people have been left out of civic processes for so long, there's actually that, like, your voice can be that much louder, you know, like when you start using it. It's like, because there's been this atrophy of the muscle, the civic muscle, like now, like it doesn't require that much muscle to win the arm wrestling match. So
Well, and you know, Adam, you bring up a good point with Block and Liberate MKE and all voting is local. You know, League of Women Voters, ACLU. What I'm most excited by is the fact that so many of these groups are working at a grassroots level. I mean, you have folks in the spirit of Freedom Summer and other eras where we saw that grassroots mobilization. We now have, I think, more so than ever, a time ever that I've witnessed, a population of folks who are educated not only about presidential elections, but state and local elections. And that's because of the grassroots education and the grassroots mobilization that's happening. That can't be overstated in terms of its importance, that in between elections, folks are knocking on doors and raising awareness and educating. It's an ongoing civic process. And, you know, it's civic education in its purest sense, you know. So thanks to those organizations. Right on. We need that.
I mean, that even too, I mean, just to that point, it's a part of voting where, like, I think my last aldermanic election was decided by less than 100 votes.
Right.
You know, like so if someone
It can
says,
be very close.
yeah, especially the lower local ones, right? Your supervisors, your aldermen, I mean, sometimes, like, yeah, like it, like you can be the vote, like, or you could be close,
Right.
or even if you talk to like 5 of your friends, you can make a big influence. So we've been moving through a lot of different spaces. Are there any, I mean, just for Eloisa and Paru, I just wanted to offer to you both, this has been sort of a wide-ranging conversation through history and in the present. Are there other sort of like core ideas that center your work that you do in the community that you'd want to share with people that you feel like they really need to know sitting in this moment?
Well, I know that that we have I feel that with the Latinx community, it's neglected until it's election time overall, and that, you know, the more we have an ongoing relationship with the different communities, bilingually, being culturally competent in our approaches, is going to better engage the Latino voter. And so just want to highlight the fact that we have a lot more information in Spanish by the League of Women Voters available to the community, and it's statewide, so please make use of that. So I think that that's part of it. The other thing is that I really think I'm looking for opportunities to really connect with the Gen Z population and to help them to navigate the electoral process. I don't know fully how to do that, and I know that there's been plenty of research out there to figure that out too. There's a lot of surveys where we're beginning to understand it. The other thing to mention is, you know, we're in the midst of this pandemic, and we had to do things differently to reach people. Talk about grassroots. Our grassroots was going out to the community, community by community working, and now we're doing it more virtually. And that was quite a, you know, talk about slamming on the brakes and doing something different. Holy cow. I mean, a number of us didn't even know how to use Zoom. And that kind of reflects our age. I just talked about myself. You know, how to reach people. And so we have to figure out new ways to reach people, especially our young people, and how to do that. I think it's so critical.
As a millennial that struggles to understand Gen Z, I'm sure someone's going to come up with a TikTok the vote campaign that will be so lame that it'll make voting cool.
I agree. I hope so.
You know, my neighbor's dog, it's my buddy Toby over here, but my neighbor's back in, and she's chronicling the confusion that we just talked about. And again, this is an informed voter. And when she saw that we were on the webinar, we had a short conversation when I muted about these very issues, the exact thing we're talking about. Here's a very educated and engaged citizen who is still trying to figure out the mechanics of our voting process.
Yeah. Yes.
And it brings us back to President Obama's eulogy again. Like these are practices and mechanisms that have to be undone. And until they are undone, we have nothing at our disposal except the grassroots mobilization that Eloise is talking about. Our political leadership is failing us in the most democratic, the most significant component to the democratic process, to where folks who are engaged are still trying to figure this out. That's what we do on the webinars, real time, right?
So I say join as many organizations as you can to learn more. Adam mentioned a few organizations. You know, this particular session right now is an opportunity for us to learn. I just, you know, go and find the information and join and be a part of the change that we need so desperately in our community.
And don't forget, there's an election next Tuesday. So, you know, opportunities to Adam's point, to be involved in, you know, local races as well. And I guess I would be remiss not to encourage people who really want to see change to also consider running for office. To Rob's point earlier of protest to politics, I think I'm excited to see the Black Lives Matter activists running and winning office right now. And again, that kind of representation matters in ways, you know, like that we see kind of play out as we watch what's happening in Congress right now, but it can really make a significant difference. And there's a lot of local offices that could use highly motivated young people running for those offices and making a change. So
Absolutely. It's their future, you know, they've got to be willing to engage in the process so that they craft the future that they want.
Look up the salaries. Seriously, some of the, actually, not all of them. County doesn't get paid that well. But aldermen and people working in city government, they get paid pretty well.
I just want to say my last is to thank all the volunteers that are out there working to promote voter access. You know, it's the variety of groups out there. I'm so proud of their efforts over time to really get out the vote, to educate the public, and I thank them all for doing that.
Canvassing is God's work. It's very difficult and very important and can be
Yes.
very effective.
Cool. That's great.
Can I just add one last screed before we finish here? I'm just sitting on my front porch. I got a package here from Amazon Prime. Sitting in August 5th of 2020, the idea that we can't organize nationwide mail-in voting when I can order 250 sleeping pills from wherever and it's delivered to my doorstep and I get several different notifications that it's coming and that I have it, and it's like, how well did they work? It's some weird dystopian science fiction futuristic world we live in that I can buy anything I want and have it in 2 days, but we're going to claim that we can't do mail-in voting, or like we don't have the infrastructure to do mail-in voting. That
Yeah,
like
that's all. Like that's a choice. That's a choice that people like. They want you to believe that it's not possible, but they're making that choice.
We don't have a day off of work to vote in this moment is also absurd.
Rob can buy a doggy bed for his neighbor and get it delivered in 2 days.
2 days.
But we want to imagine that we can't do mail-in voting. I mean, it's
Right.
utterly ridiculous.
And of course, all of that we know is, again, political decisions intended to limit those who engage in the political process
Exactly.
in a so-called democracy.